Back off him. Joanna Baird didn't shout it. Her voice came out the same way it always did when she was working through a problem. Level, with nothing extra. 3 men stood in the parking lot of the Irving station on Route 9, just outside Creston Falls, Ontario. 9:15 on a Thursday in late October, cold enough that her breath showed. She'd stopped to fill the truck on the way home from locking the garage, and she still had grease under her nails and a mental ledger running that never seemed to balance. The older man on the asphalt was somewhere in his 60s. Silver hair, a leather cut over a flannel jacket, the kind of vest that carried actual road on it. His Harley Softail was on its side 10 feet away, oil spreading slow and dark beneath it. One of the 3 men standing over him had a fist in the collar of his cut. The second was watching the rest of the lot. The third held a phone and wasn't filming anything, which somehow felt worse. Joanna's hand closed around the tow chain she'd pulled from the bed of her truck without thinking. The same way she reached for the right tool when an engine started making a sound it shouldn't. The 3 turned. The tallest looked at her, young, maybe 25, with the expression of someone who had never been interrupted before, and smiled. "You lost, sweetheart?" "Walk away," she said, "or don't your call." She had no plan. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She had a length of chain, a voice staying even, and 27 years of her father's lessons about what happened to broken things when nobody bothered to fix them. The man on the ground found her eyes and held them. She didn't look away from the 3. The tallest one glanced at the pump cameras, then at her chain, then at an older woman in a minivan near the entrance who had rolled her window down and was watching without pretending otherwise. "Let's go," he said. They went. Not fast. The way people left when they needed it, understood that the leaving was their idea. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Joanna set the chain on the hood of her truck and walked to the man on the ground. "Don't," he said. "Don't what?" "Say I'm fine." Wasn't going to. She crouched and looked at him the way she looked at a machine that had taken damage, not with alarm but with attention, a cut above his left eyebrow, his left arm held carefully against his ribs. The way he was breathing, shallow and controlled, said something was cracked. "Can you stand?" "In a minute. Take your time." His name was Edmund Harlow. He told her that when they were in the cab of her truck, her driving and him sitting straight back because slouching hurt. He'd been riding back from visiting his daughter in Owen Sound when a car cut him off on the 9 and sent him into the gravel. The 3 had been there before he'd gotten the bike upright. "Your bike's at the Irving," she said. "Station manager said they'd hold it overnight." He looked at her sidelong. "You already called." "Before they left," she said, while they were still deciding. He was quiet for a moment. The highway ran straight through the spruce, reflectors ticking past in the dark. "Edmund Harlow," he said again, like confirming something to himself. His club brothers called him Buck. She'd read that on a patch she hadn't made obvious she was reading. "Joanna Baird," she kept her eyes on the road. "Baird's Automotive. County Road 7 in Creston Falls. My dad started it 31 years ago. I took it over 2 years back." He didn't ask how. Men like Edmund Harlow, she was already learning, understood that some answers lived in the space around the question. The Creston Falls Regional Hospital was 40 minutes east. Edmund didn't want an ambulance. She drove his truck while he rode in hers, and the urgent care waiting room was quiet enough that she could hear the fluorescent lights humming. She stayed, which she hadn't planned on. There was a timing belt job waiting at the shop, a stack of invoices she owed responses to, a month end that wasn't going to sort itself. She stayed anyway. When he came back out, 2 ribs confirmed cracked, the eyebrow closed with steri strips. He sat across from her and said, without preamble, "What do you owe on the shop?" "I don't know you. You sat in that waiting room for an hour. That doesn't make you my accountant." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "No," he said, "it doesn't." A pause. "Come by the shop tomorrow. I want to see something." "The bike isn't there yet." "A few things," he said, "not just the bike." He came the next morning with 2 others. She heard them before she saw them. 3 bikes turning off County Road 7 onto her gravel lot with the unhurried precision of riders who had been doing this long enough that a machine was just an extension of thought. Edmund in the middle. On his left, a broad man with a close-cropped gray beard and patches she could read from 20 feet, Iron Shore MC. On his right, a quieter man with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, blinking into the morning like he was still deciding whether it was worth the trouble. Edmund introduced them as Gord Phelan and Stuart McRae. Phelan went by Phelan. Stuart went by Stu until you knew him, and then still Stu. They were polite. They looked around the shop the way people looked at something when they were assessing whether the person who ran it knew what they were doing. She worked on Edmund's Harley while they watched. The primary seal was bad, as she'd expected from the oil pattern she'd noted the night before at the Irving lot. She found two other issues while she was in there and laid them out as she found them, not to perform competence, but because that was how she'd been taught. Her father used to say a mechanic who hid problems was a mechanic who didn't trust their own hands. When she quoted the job, Edmund didn't negotiate. He named a day. Then can we look at the books? She set down her ratchet. No, I'm not offering charity. I know what you're offering. The answer's still no. He looked at her steadily. Stu had his glasses on now and was looking at the framed photograph on the wall above the tool cabinet. Her father, younger, standing beside a '79 Trans Am he'd pulled out of a field and restored himself. Is that your dad? Stu asked. Yes. When did he pass? 2 years ago, June. Stroke. He was 59. Stu was quiet. Then I might have met him. Raleigh and Tobermory, maybe 15 years back. Danny Baird? The name in his mouth. Danny, the way her father's old friends had said it. Before the last 2 years, when the friends got fewer and the worry got louder. Landed somewhere she hadn't been guarding against. He was there, she said. He rode every summer until about 5 years ago. Talked about his daughter, Stu said. Said she could read an engine better than he could. Said he was trying to figure out how to tell her without her getting a big head about it. Joanna turned back to the Harley and picked up a rag and did something with her hands. She got a big head anyway, she said. She got the files. It took Edmund 25 minutes to read 2 years of her financial life. Gord leaned in twice and pointed at items on the page without speaking. Stu had his glasses on and was reading over Edmund's shoulder by the end. When Edmund looked up, something had settled in his face that hadn't been there before. Focused, quiet, waited. Who is Lakeshore Capital? He asked. She'd heard the name 3 times in the past 14 months. Once in a letter with clean letterhead and a generous offer to purchase Baird's Automotive at what they called fair market value. Once when a man named Lawrence Gregg had come to the shop in person, expensive jacket, practiced reassurance in every sentence, and sat across her workbench and talked about development corridors and community investment and what a smart exit looked like for a young woman carrying a business loan on her own. Once more in a follow-up letter, the number higher, the tone slightly softer. She'd said no each time. They want to buy, she said. They've contacted you 3 times in 14 months, Edmund said. The intervals are deliberate. Gord had his arms crossed, watching her with the specific attention of a man who had seen a pattern before and was deciding how much of it to say out loud. They're not just buyers, he said. We've seen this structure before. They identify properties they want. Then they make acquiring them easier than buying them clean. Joanna sat down on the stool near the bench. Customers start disappearing, Gord continued. Then rumors you can't source. Then regulatory pressure. Inspections, complaints, nothing that sticks, but all of it costs time and money and confidence. After enough of that, even a healthy business starts to look like a failing one. To the bank, to outsiders, to the owner. He paused. And then the offer comes in and feels like a lifeline. She thought about the 3 dealership accounts she'd lost in her first year. Long-standing clients of her father's, all gone within 4 months of each other, all with different polite explanations. She'd told herself it was the economy. She'd told herself she wasn't her father. She'd told herself a lot of things. My dad lost accounts too, she said, his last year. He thought he'd done something wrong. He spent 12 months trying to figure out what. She looked at the floor, at the concrete her father had poured himself in the spring of 1993. He died thinking he'd failed his own business. Nobody said anything. The shop settled around them. Who does your banking? Edmund asked. Gordon Hatch had managed the Baird family accounts for 22 years. He'd been at her father's funeral, front row, wife beside him, standing outside the church on King Street afterward to shake Joanna's hand and say, Your father was the finest man I've had the honor of knowing in this work. He'd said it with the steady eye contact of a man who believed himself while doing his opposite. It was Gord who found it, through public filings and 2 layers of numbered corporations. Gordon Hatch was a principal in a holding company that served as the financing bridge between Lakeshore Capital's acquisition arm and the development group holding the permits for a mixed-use resort and marina project along the Creston Falls waterfront strip. The waterfront strip, County Road 7. Baird's Automotive was on County Road 7. She was at the workbench when Edmund told her. She had a socket wrench in her hand and she set it down very carefully. He controls my loan, she said. Yes. He knows exactly what I can and can't absorb. He's known since the beginning. Yes. She walked to the bay door and looked out at the lot. A car passed on the road without slowing. She thought about every potential customer she'd watched turn in at the driveway over the past 2 years and keep going. How many times she'd told herself she was imagining a pattern in the losing. Don't go near him, Edmund said quietly. Don't change how you act around him. Don't let him know we have this. He was at the funeral, she said. She said it like a fact rather than an accusation, because that was all she had the voice for right now. I know. He shook my hand. Joanna. His voice was level and careful. I know. Stay the course. The filing boxes were in her apartment above the garage. She hadn't opened them in over a year. It hurt to go through her father's handwriting, and there was always something more urgent. And she'd told herself she'd get to them when things eased. Things had not eased. She carried the boxes down herself and opened the first one on the shop floor. Her father's handwriting looked up at her, neat and angular, the handwriting of a man who had learned early that records were the difference between a business and a rumor. The notes went back years, business logs, yes, but also observations. Things he'd noticed and written down because they felt important even when he couldn't say precisely why. Council decisions that had affected his property taxes, a dark SUV that had parked across from the shop on 3 separate occasions, a conversation with Albert Kwan, who ran the hardware store 2 properties east, about a development company that had been asking questions along the waterfront road. Near the bottom of the second box in a folder dated 18 months before her father died, a letter from Lawrence Gregg. The same name, the same man who had come to the shop in person 3 months after Joanna had taken over. Gregg had gone to her father first. The offer in the letter was lower, significantly lower, and clipped to the back was her father's handwritten draft response. 3 sentences. Mr. Gregg, thank you for your interest in Baird's Automotive. It is not for sale. And at the bottom, smaller, almost like a note to himself. Find out who's making Albert nervous. Find out who's behind this. Joanna sat on the concrete floor with the paper in her hands. Edmund crouched beside her and read without being asked. When he stood, there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Older and harder and very still. He knew, she said. He was getting there, Edmund said. He'd gotten farther than most people would have. And then he died. Yes, a pause. Your father did something for me a long time ago. Nothing dramatic. He stepped in when he didn't have to, and he told me if he ever needed anything, he had my word. Edmund's jaw tightened slightly. I found out he was in trouble 2 weeks before he died. I was going to come out. I waited. He held her gaze. That's on me. I'm not waiting this time. There were 4 other business owners along County Road 7 who had been through versions of the same thing. Gord found them through public records and the kind of conversations that happened between people who trusted men they could see in front of them rather than institutions they couldn't. Carl Pittman had owned a marine repair shop for 19 years. Past tense. He'd sold to a holding company 16 months back. 2 subsidiary layers removed from Lakeshore Capital but connected. He'd lost his 3 biggest commercial accounts in 6 weeks before the offer arrived, each with different explanations, all in the same narrow window. When Joanna called him, he was quiet for a long time and then said, "How did you get this number?" "A friend," she said. Another silence. "I signed something when I sold." "I'm not asking about the sale. I want to know if you'd be willing to meet. Because I think what happened to your shop wasn't bad luck. And I think you might know things that could help me keep mine." Carl Pittman arrived at the Tim Hortons on the highway before she did. He was already there when she pulled in, sitting with a coffee he hadn't touched. His hands the thick, scarred hands of a man who had done marine work his whole life. Yvonne Brossard had run a bait and tackle shop at the east end of the strip. She hadn't sold, but she'd lost 40% of her summer commercial accounts in 1 season and was surviving on loyal regulars and what she described, without embarrassment, as the stubbornness she'd inherited from her mother. She had a folder on her kitchen table before Joanna sat down. Albert Kwan's hardware store was still open. He'd been the one her father's notes mentioned, the one Daniel Baird had gone to see about a pattern he was starting to recognize. "Your father sat right where you're standing," Albert said from behind his counter. He had a recorder and he asked permission before he turned it on. "We talked for 2 hours, he paused. He left something for me to hold." The envelope was standard white, sealed with tape, her father's name on the front in his own hand. Albert said, if anyone came asking the right questions, I was to give it to them. He went into the back and was gone 4 minutes and came out with it and handed it over without ceremony. She sat in her truck in Albert's parking lot and opened it. 1 page, both sides. Her father's handwriting careful and close. A timeline, 5 businesses on County Road 7, the dates their trouble had started, drawn from conversations her father had conducted one by one. Side by side on the page, the pattern was undeniable. Each business had experienced a cluster of problems at staggered intervals, as though each one had been started on a schedule. At the bottom of the second side, 4 names. Lawrence Gregg, a numbered company with a note, front connects to Gregg. Dennis Ashby, Creston Falls Municipal Planning, and the 4th Gordon Hatch. Next to Hatch's name in smaller letters, board member numbered co, holds my loan. Inside this from the start. She sat with the page for a long time. The October sky pressed gray and flat over the spruce tops. She thought about Gordon Hatch at her father's funeral. The steadiness of his grip, the warmth in his voice when he said the finest man I've had the honor of knowing in this work. She thought about every loan review she'd sat through in that office, every time she'd answered honestly when he'd asked how things were going, every number she'd given him freely because he was family in all but name. She called Edmund. She told him the fourth name. He was quiet for 2 full seconds. Don't change anything, he said. Don't call him. Don't go to the bank. He shook my hand at the funeral, she said. Her voice had gone somewhere level and strange. I know, Edmund said. We're close. Stay the course. Dennis Ashby ran the Creston Falls Planning and Development Committee from a tidy office in the municipal building on Elm Street. He stood when Joanna and Edmund came in. He smiled the smile of a man deploying a learned behavior while his mind was running a different calculation entirely. He talked, eventually, not all at once and not without cost to himself, but in the way things came out of men who had been carrying something for too long and found themselves suddenly in a room with people who already knew the shape of it. A consultant connected to Greg's organization had approached him 4 years ago, friendly professional, asked for help identifying properties along the waterfront corridor, zoning information publicly available, nothing dramatic, then more. Which owners were financially stressed, which were older, more inclined toward an exit, which properties were essential to the corridor's continuity. Ashby had provided it, telling himself it was economic development, telling himself it was good for the town. When Daniel Baird stood at a planning association meeting 18 months before he died and described, in careful and specific language, a pattern of targeting along County Road 7, connected the properties on a map in front of 40 people. Ashby had called the consultant the next morning and reported everything that had been said and who had said it. What happened after that? Joanna asked. She had worked very hard that morning to keep her voice where she needed it. Ashby pressed his lips together. 3 weeks later, I heard your father had a stroke. The office held that. I didn't believe it was connected, he said. I still don't believe. Did Hatch tell you he'd had a heart condition? Edmund said. A pause. Yes. Then there's a conversation we need to have about what you're willing to put on paper. The lawyer Edmund brought was a woman named Helen Sabo, who drove up from Guelph the following afternoon in a car with 280,000 kilometers on it, and a briefcase organized in a way that made Joanna trust her immediately. Helen listened to everything without interrupting. When they finished, she set her pen down. You have enough for a civil suit against Lakeshore and the numbered company, and potentially against Hatch depending on Ashby's formal statement. For criminal exposure, you need someone who directed specific acts, the account cancellations, the complaints, someone inside the structure. She looked at Joanna. The immediate threat is your loan. If Hatch triggers an early review and calls the note, you're in a very difficult position regardless of what else we're building. I can file a motion today asserting predatory lending based on his conflict of interest. It won't hold indefinitely, but it buys time, and it tells him we know. It also tells him we're moving, Edmund said. Yes. Helen looked at him steadily. Are you ready for that? We have what we have, Edmund said. If he knows he has 2 choices, he moves against her, which now looks like retaliation inside a legal proceeding, or he pulls back. Either way, we're better positioned than we are keeping this quiet. A pause. The quiet phase is over. Helen filed the motion at noon the following day. By 2 o'clock, Gordon Hatch's attorney had called her office 3 times. Greg came to the shop. She'd expected it, the way you expected weather when you'd been watching the sky long enough. He arrived at 6:45 after she'd officially closed. A quiet engine in the lot, footsteps that were deliberate and unhurried. The footsteps of a man who had done difficult conversations before and had found a way to make himself comfortable in them. She counted 4 seconds after his knock before she opened the door. Lawrence Gregg was 61, easy posture, a jacket that hadn't come from anywhere near Creston Falls, a smile calibrated for situations that required management. Mrs. Baird, he said, I apologize for the hour. She stepped back and let him in. Let him look at the shop. A place told people things about the person who kept it, and she wanted him to read this one correctly. He got to the point quickly, which was what people did when they had a prepared approach they wanted to seem spontaneous. He understood there had been some legal activity around her loan. Some conversations with people about the waterfront project. He wanted to be direct, he said, because some of what she might have heard could be incomplete. Tell me your version, Joanna said, and I'll tell you where it matches what I know. She watched him recalibrate. She was younger than he'd expected her to be in the moment, or more composed. He'd come here expecting financial desperation. He offered a number, a real number, fair market value, and a settlement for any concerns around how the acquisition process had unfolded, as he put it. The number was significant. 6 months ago, it would have felt like being pulled out of deep water. No, she said. He blinked. Ms. Baird, the legal motion you filed is a holding action. We both know that. She looked at him evenly. What you're actually worried about isn't the loan motion. What you're worried about is the Attorney General's office taking an interest in how Lakeshore Capital has been operating on this corridor. Dennis Ashby gave a formal statement 2 days ago. He was at a dinner 14 months ago where you discussed applying more direct pressure to this property specifically, because the financial approach was taking longer than projected. That dinner is on record now. The smile was gone. This shop is not for sale, she said. This conversation is over. He stood there another moment, sorting through what remained available to him, finding it smaller than when he'd walked in. You should think very carefully, he said, and it was the closest he'd come to what was actually underneath the whole visit. The bay door behind him opened. Edmund walked in, Gord behind him, Stu behind Gord, reading glasses still pushed up on his forehead. Greg looked at them, looked back at Joanna. Good night, Mr. Gregg, she said. He left without rushing, because men like Greg never rushed. The taillights cleared the lot and disappeared around the bend on County Road 7. Helen Sabo stepped out from behind the shop truck, where she'd spent the last 20 minutes with a voice recorder in her coat pocket. Every word, she said. Her pen was already moving. The package went to the Ontario Provincial Police Major Crime Unit and the Attorney General's office the following morning. Ashby's formal statement. The financial documentation tracing Lakeshore's structure to Hatch's numbered company. Her father's handwritten timeline, found in an envelope left with a hardware store owner who had been waiting 2 years for someone to come asking the right questions. The recording from the shop. 3 weeks after filing, Lakeshore Capital's legal counsel made contact with Helen. The waterfront development project, as currently planned, was being restructured. All outstanding approaches to properties on County Road 7 were formally withdrawn. A civil settlement offer was on the table, with explicit written acknowledgement of the targeting scheme. In plain language, no passive voice, no corporate euphemism. Compensation for the businesses sold under depressed conditions. Joanna held out for the acknowledgement. So did Yvonne Broussard and Pete McCullough, who ran the welding shop 2 properties east and had watched 3 municipal contracts disappear in a year, and spent that time convinced he was simply past his prime. Gordon Hatch resigned from every board he sat on in a single morning. His attorney put out a statement about personal matters. Helen told Joanna it meant his lawyers had looked at the regulatory referral from the banking board and told him to remove himself before he was removed. Carl Pittman called when the settlement was confirmed. He said he and his son had looked at a smaller space near the marina. Nothing like the old shop, but theirs. He said, your dad would have been something else to have around this month. She laughed, and it surprised her a little. He would have been insufferable, she said. He would have called everyone he knew. The good kind, Carl said. Yvonne sent a text. First morning in 2 years I didn't dread unlocking the door, thank you. Albert Kwan called on a Sunday. He said he'd stood in front of the photo of Daniel Baird on his own shop wall and told it what had happened, then felt strange about it, then decided he didn't feel strange about it at all. She called them all, one evening in November, from the phone on her workbench. The shop was quiet around her, the refrigerator humming, the fluorescent over Bay 2 doing its low buzz, the wind off Georgian Bay working at the eaves the way it always did when the temperature dropped past 0. She called each one and said the same thing in different words. It's moving. You're not in this alone. On the other end of the last call, Pete McCullough went quiet for long enough that she thought the line had dropped. Then he said, I thought I'd just gotten too old for it, the work. I thought I was the problem. You weren't the problem, she said. No, he said. I know that now. She hung up and sat on the stool by the bench for a while. Outside through the bay window, County Road 7 ran east and west through the dark. The other shops sat quiet under November sky, signs unlit, lots empty, all of them still standing. Edmund had been at the shop earlier that evening. He'd stayed an hour, drank a coffee, read through the settlement documents without being asked, said they looked solid. Before he left, he'd stood a moment looking at the framed photograph on the wall. Her father and the Trans Am, 1993, somewhere in the middle of everything he'd been building. He left that envelope with Albert, Edmund said mostly to himself. He knew someone would come. He believed someone would, she said. Edmund looked at her. Whatever he was going to say, he kept. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something settled a question he'd already mostly answered. She locked the shop an hour later and stood a minute in the parking lot before getting in her truck. The cold came in off the bay with a purpose to it. The shop sign was still lit. Baird's Automotive, the lettering her father, had stenciled himself 31 years ago because he couldn't yet afford the commercial sign company he'd had in mind. He hadn't been able to afford a lot of things in that last year. She understood why now, and it had nothing to do with him. She got in the truck. Full slate at 7 in the morning, 2 brake jobs, a coolant flush, and an electrical problem on a Silverado that had been making her think all week. She drove home on County Road 7 the way she always did, The shop sign stayed lit in her mirror until the road bent and the trees closed in and it was gone. Same as it had been every night for 31 years, patient and yellow against the dark.